Hi, Room 6. Today we're going to be doing an activity called Sink or Float. It's kind of like a science experiment. So for this activity, all you're going to need is some paper. And here I labeled it sink with an arrow going down because if it's heavy, the density is kind of heavier, so I did an anchor. Here I put float with an arrow going up and drew a little sailboat. So this means if the object that I'm going to be using is going to sink, it's going to go in this column. And if the object I use is going to float, it's going to go in this column. So all you'll need is paper, something to write with, a bowl of water. I'm going to use this small bowl. You can use a bowl, a bucket, your bathtub, anything that you want that you can put water in, but I'm going to use a bowl. And then I found 10 objects that fit into my bowl to see whether they sink or float. Now, before we actually test the objects to see if they sink or float, we're going to make some predictions. That means kind of like a smart guess. So before we test to see if the objects are going to sink or float, we're going to guess and predict which objects we think will sink or float. So for this object here, this is like a suction cup. I think this object is going to float because it kind of feels light. Feels really light, so I'm going to put it in my float section. And for this object, it's a cotton ball. It's very soft and light, so I also think that it's going to float. This object is a rock. It's very hard, it's not too heavy, but I think it's going to sink, so I'm going to put it in my sink section. This object is a screw. It also feels like it's kind of heavy and sharp, so I think it'll go in the sink section. This is like a play earring. I think that this object will sink. This is a nickel, and I also predict that this object will sink. This is a bobby pin. I think this object will float. I feel like maybe the holes in it and the density will also make it float in the water. This is something that helps us measure if something is straight. I forgot the name of it, but I'll put it in my picture when I show you. I think this will float because it has liquid inside, and I think it will float. This is a bath bomb. They're supposed to go in the bathtub, but it's still wrapped up in the plastic. So I still think it's gonna float. This is something I use to shape my eggs when I make them. So I'm gonna call it like an egg shaper. I think this will also float. So I'm gonna show you a picture of my predictions and then we'll get started. Okay, so I have my chart paper with sink or float written on it, my bowl of water, and also a towel just in case the objects were to get wet before I put them on my paper. I'll have them dry first. So I also added a Q-tip to my collection, and I think the Q-tip will float. So let's get started. I'm gonna do the suction cup first. This is the one that I thought would float. It sunk. And it's kind of almost floating, but it sunk. So I'm gonna let this dry here on the towel before I put it on my paper. Next, I'm gonna test the Q-tip. I think this object still is going to float. And yes, it's floating. You know it's floating because it didn't make that loud sound when it touched the bottom of the bowl, and it's also kind of looks like it's swimming. So I'm gonna put this on the side. Next, I'm gonna try my bobby pin. I predicted that this would float, but oops, it sunk to the bottom of the bowl. I'm gonna take it out. Oh no, she's giving me a hard time. Okay, take it out and let it dry. Next, I'm gonna try the cotton ball. So the cotton ball is really soft and light, and I think it's gonna float, kind of similar to the Q-tip. So let's see. It's sinking. So I'm noticing when the cotton ball is dry, it floats, but once it gets wet and starts to get heavy, because the water weighs it down, it sinks to the bottom of the bowl. How about if we squeeze all the water out? Nope. Oh, yeah, it's floating again. So we just notice when the cotton ball is wet and has water in it, it makes it heavier and it floats down. But this is still something that floats, so I'm gonna put it in the float section still. Next, I'm gonna try the rock. I predicted that this item would sink just because it's kind of heavy. And, oh yeah, a loud thud tells us that it's definitely a sink object. Next, I'm gonna try this play earring. I think it's going to also sink. Yeah, it sunk pretty fast. Next, we're gonna try the screw. I also think that this screw is going to sink just because it is kind of heavy. Yep, it's a sinker. Next, I'm gonna try this nickel. It's kind of small. It's still small, but I feel it's very, very heavy. So I'm gonna try, yep, it's a sinker. Next, I'm gonna try this object because I thought since it had water and an air bubble in it that it might float, but it definitely sunk. Next, we have this bath bomb that still has the plastic on it. These normally sink or float in the water in the bathtub sometimes when I use them. So I thought that it would still float, but it looks like it's sunk. Yeah, it's definitely something that sinks into. And last, I have my egg mate that helps my egg keep my egg round and small. I'm gonna call it like an egg shaper. Also an item that sinks in the bowl. So there we have it. All of my objects, I'm gonna wait till they dry and then I'll show you a picture of the objects on paper. I had a lot of fun with this experiment at home, and I'm curious to see other objects that you can find at home that sink and float, because I only found 2 objects that floated, so I'm wondering what else I have in my house that floats. And if you had fun watching this video, you can try it at home in the bathtub, in a bucket, or in a bowl like me, and find tiny objects that fit inside and test them out. And you can show us a picture on Google Classroom so we can see all the different things you found at home. Bye!